Hi folks, this is DIY Germany. My name is Lars and I have to do something about my crosscut sled because of this. It's too big anyway.
Well, that's unfortunate. The oh so mighty crosscut sled. Well, for most of those who have a miter saw, this very likely isn't that much of an issue. But since I don't have room for a miter saw, which is why the idea of getting one never even crossed my mind, I more or less have to do my crosscuts on the table saw. For rough cutting, the miter gauge is good enough, in most cases. But when it comes to accuracy, the go-to for more or less everyone who works on a job site table saw is building a crosscut sled. And so I did, last spring, after getting myself the Evolution table saw. And I made it big, bigger than the table of the saw itself. And I used what I had at hand at that time and slapped a sled together in something like an hour, or probably less. And it did the job. You might have noticed I'm simply taking a hammer to the runners to remove them. I never bothered to put screws in. The only thing holding them in place was CA glue. Yep. I made the runners from some pallet wood strips and the whole thing worked fine. Until it didn't.
That's actually not bad.
See, in my case the runners are either pine or fir, and since these softwoods have quite a tendency to soak up moisture and swell, which I knew but went ahead with it anyway.
Okay.
I did expect the sled to cause issues once the weather conditions change.
There's the culprit.
This time around I chose to use what we here in Germany call Siebdruckplatte, which basically is birch ply sealed with a screen print on both surfaces. This stuff is used on trailers for bottoms and sides, for instance, and it holds up very well outside as long as the edges are properly sealed. And since it's ply, I don't expect much swelling, which makes it a good choice for the runners, if you don't want to use plastic. I cut it very close to fit, and used a sanding block for fine-tuning. As a side note, these rubber cleaners for sandpapers are awesome. I use mine a lot, and they're dead cheap. If you don't have one, I recommend getting one. Saves considerably on sandpaper and sanding discs. I opted to only use one runner on the new sled, because the sled will only cover one side of the blade. For what I'm doing, this will be more than sufficient. And yeah, I just had to show you again how nicely the rubber cleans the sanding block. Well. As for the sled bottom, I reused the one half of the old sled and gave it a quick rub with the orbital. On a yoga mat. Works great.
Alrighty, now this is sanded up to 120, which is fine for this. Doesn't need to be any smoother. It's going to get waxed anyway. So the sled I'm building is not going to be as big as the old one was, because most of the time I cut slats on the crosscut sled. If it gets any bigger, I'm going to use the Trek saw anyway. So, because I only have a small saw, as you can see. Alright, so. Alright, a tiny bow here, but quite a bow in here, which is not going to be a problem, because, first of all, I'm going to put the fence here, which is going to pull that straight, and I don't need the full width. Alright, let's get cutting.
Once I was okay with the size of the base, I threw a couple of hex nuts in the T-track to make sure no glue would squeeze out on the table saw top. And then, yeah, I again laid a thick bead of CA glue to fix the runner to the base. No wood glue, no screws. See, CA glue makes a really strong surface bond, and if I were to wedge the runners off vertically, it would most certainly tear out the wood fibers from the bottom. Sideways, the hold isn't nearly as strong. Still, it is sufficient enough for this use, unless you force them to let go, as shown before when I just knocked them off with a hammer. Now to the part that almost everyone on the internet makes look so difficult. First off, I flush cut the base, taking it slow to make sure I have a clean edge. This will later give me a reference once I add the fence. The old fence had worked fine, but what had always bothered me was the height, which made it uncomfortable for me to hold the piece that I was cutting, so I trimmed it down. I obviously never bothered to glue it up last year. Well, so this time around I chose to glue the 3 layers of ply together to give me a firm and stable fence. And by staggering them I could even add some stability to what used to be the through cut. Okay, time to cut the fence to length. And for reference, I simply used the base that was already made. Actually, this part doesn't even have to be totally precise, because once assembled, any overhang would be cut off anyway. Now, as to fixing the fence to the base, I tend to not make too much of a science thing of that. To be honest, I don't even get what all the fuss is about when it comes to building crosscut sleds. Sure, it should be accurate, but how accurate is accurate enough? First off, a single screw on one side, so I have a pivot point. Then all I do is taking a trusted square. In this case, an old carpenter square, which I know is dead on 90. And line the fence up to the reference edge of the base, which in this case was a little fiddly, as the carpenter square doesn't have a lip on one side, but we'll see in a bit how to make this just so much easier. Anyway, once it looked fine, I pulled the trigger on the clamp, which was already loosely in place, and clamped the fence to the base. And then I put a second screw in on the opposite end. And done. Oh, so I thought. Well, that's unfortunate. Yeah, I didn't even check if the fence in itself was straight. Well, and instead of getting the thickness of planer out, I opted on using the table saw to nibble away that tiny bit in the center of the board, which worked fine. That's good enough. Now to the even easier way to position the fence on the base, since I obviously had to reattach it. Yeah, exactly. The good old speed square, which is also trusted 90 and has a handy lip on one side. And in this case I didn't even bother to use a clamp. I just held it firmly with my hand. Counterbolt. Sorry for the camera angle. And then sunk a screw in. Done. Nice. Now, on to the first cut. Okay. I could actually call it done at this point, but hey, the oh so holy 5-cut method, which actually only takes 4 cuts to know. Cut, turn a quarter, cut, turn a quarter, cut, turn a quarter, and cut again. And cut 1 and 4 will show you how accurate it is. Now let's see. That is very much on point. Well, of course it is. Now, talking 12.24 and another 12.36. So it's perfectly spot on. After 36 inches. Good. Meaning after 4 cuts covering 4 90-degree angles and a distance of 36 inches total, it is dead on. Can't get any more accurate with this method, and quite frankly, and most importantly, it doesn't have to. That being said, I gave the bottom of the base a layer of linseed oil and left it overnight. Waxed it the next day and then started using the sled. Having only half a sled is perfectly fine for the things I cut around here. And I don't actually need a stop block or something, since there is this clever little thing on the table saw called fence, which can and should be moved away before the cut for clearance, to prevent kickback. Or I can also clamp a little block to the fence and lock it in place, which gives me a reference point for repeating cuts and also makes sure there's enough clearance so nothing comes flying at me. And yes, I did actually slap together a second sled, which is rather tiny, but for cutting miters like this it works just fine. And you already saw how easy it is to build this and make it somewhat accurate. Anyway, the point is, I'd rather have 2 dedicated sleds than one huge heavy monstrosity. Also, that second sled, when turned 180, provides support for pieces cut on the first sled. Something I hadn't thought of until now, but makes perfect sense to me with regards to safety. And once I get to building a new cart for the table saw, the sleds will be hanging on the sides of that cart. But for now they've found a home on the wall. Okay. Now, since you're still around, I may kindly ask you for a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't, and let me know in the comments what you think about all the YouTube fuzz around the mighty table saw crosscut sled. Thanks folks, until next time, be safe, be good, see ya, cheers.